Late one evening around Christmas time, about 60 years ago, a man was traveling from one village to another. He traveled in thickly falling snow, reaching his destination after midnight as the snow was beginning to lessen, and approaching the door of the inn where he sought entrance, he knocked. This particular inn was an old establishment that had been his goal since he had left the previous town, for he knew of it and had often thought of stopping in the past. A good friend of his often stayed there on trips and had recommended it. However, upon the door opening, he was dismayed to be told that there were no vacancies, and even if there had been, he would not have been allowed to enter without a reservation. It was then that he remembered his friend telling him to be sure to make a reservation first, and he had just failed to remember this fact. The doorman was kind, but of course couldn't let him stay. The man left and hastened to find some other place to stay, as the snow had again begun coming down faster. He at last was able to find shelter for the night on a bench in the entry of another hotel. He was able to fall asleep with his coat for warmth, and as he slept, he dreamed 2 dreams. The first dream was this. He dreamed that he was once again traveling on a road on a journey, but his garb was of the east, and he was with a company of many travelers. He was not certain where he was going, but it seemed his destination was certain if only he could remember what it was. All at once he found himself in front of an inn. For a moment he thought he was awake and reliving the previous few hours, but looking down he saw that he was still in his eastern garb. He did not know what to do, so he knocked at the inn. As it happened to him earlier, he was told there was no room. He turned and journeyed away. The road took him up a hill and behind the inn. There was a stable there that belonged to the proprietors of the inn, and as he passed it, he heard the sounds of voices and animals. He was going to pass on with no thought for the stable, when all at once he heard the sound of a baby. Thinking this peculiar, he ventured over to the stable door and opened it. What a strange sight met his eyes, for there among the animals were a man and a woman, and indeed a baby. It was a beautiful child, and he could not keep his eyes from it. As he looked at the baby, he heard himself asking a question, and, as is so common in dreams, he was not speaking, but could hear his thoughts spoken aloud. And these were his thoughts. I suppose you did not make a reservation ahead of time either, or you would not be having your baby in a stable. He heard the answer in his own heart as though the man or woman had answered him, but to his eyes he had not disturbed them. And the answer was this. The reservation was made hundreds of years before this child was to be born, and the reservation was made for this town and this place. It has come to pass as it was foretold. While he thought on this answer that to him seemed strange, he saw the stable door open and old men and young men and a few boys enter the stable. With them were sheep. He knew in an instant that they were shepherds, and as they came and looked, he saw them bow as if to worship the baby. Then his heart began to remember the story he had been told as a child, and he asked himself, "Am I in Bethlehem?" It was then also in his dream that he began to hear the voices of children singing, not as part of the scene in history, but as part of his dream, and they sang to welcome the child.
Tears are falling, hearts are breaking, and we need to hear from God.
As the voices faded away, the man awoke in the hotel lobby in a sudden panic as though he had missed something important. But before he could discern what he had not understood, he turned over and fell asleep again, only to dream a second dream that was longer, more real, and stranger than the first. He was once again in front of an entry of some sort, but what sort he was unsure. There was a long line of people, and as he looked at them closely, they seemed to be people from all ages and places, past, present, and future. One moment they looked like those he saw on the street daily, then they took on the look of the old-fashioned pictures in his mother's album, and then the line of people would look like they had stepped out of a Bible picture storybook he had had as a baby. These people were one at a time going before a man who sat at a table with something in front of him. He could not see what it was in front of the other man, and in his dream he watched himself go closer to the table till he was able to hear what the man was saying to each person coming before him. At this close advantage, he could also see that the man at the table had a great book open before him. As each person came close, he heard the man at the table asking them all the same question, and it was this: "Do you have a reservation to get in?" He would listen to the answer and then open his book and search through it for the person's name. He would find it and then allow them entrance into the doorway behind him. The first person to come before him was an elderly woman. When asked if she had a reservation, she smiled unhesitatingly and said, "You'll see I made a reservation 70 years ago when I was but a small child of 8. I heard about this place and didn't want to fail to be admitted. I feared dying, for I was a sickly child, but I loved the Savior who died for me and asked that he would reserve me a place with him. He allowed me to live 70 more years for him." The second person to come before the man was a child 5 years old, and his answer to the question was simple. "I made a reservation only 1 hour ago at the end of church, right before I walked out of the building and was hit by that automobile." The third person was an older man, and he looked shamefaced as he stepped forward and heard the question. His answer was quiet. "You'll find that I made a reservation 60 years ago. Then a little while later I was mocked for preparing in advance for something that my friend said was years away. I tried to forget that I made a reservation. It was hard at first, but pretty soon I was forgetting for years at a time. I never showed my friends how to make reservations on their own. I made a mess of my life trying to forget God. Then 3 years ago I came under such conviction that I turned my life back over to God. I told him that my life wasn't much, but he could have the rest of it. I'm so glad that we are kept by God's power and not our own, or I wouldn't be here. I would have easily misplaced my reservation if it had been left up to me." A teenage boy was the fourth person. "Well, sir," he said, "for 6 years I trusted that my mom's and dad's reservations would get me here. Then last year it occurred to me that I had to make my own or it was no good, so I did at that time." A fifth person stepped up to the table. "At a revival when I was a girl, I decided to make a reservation. I meant it when I asked for it and was so happy to have it. Then when I went home, my friends told me that I couldn't be absolutely sure about something like that. So for the next 4 years, I kept asking God to make sure my reservation was still good. He was very patient with me, and I eventually understood that verse that says we are kept by the power of God. Then I told God I was sorry for not believing he was powerful enough to remember that I'd made a reservation. Then I had peace from those doubts and could serve God with my whole heart." The sixth person's story was interesting. "My parents told me I'd made a reservation when I was 3, but I didn't remember a bit of it, except maybe the praying part, but I didn't understand what I was doing. I understood how to make a reservation when I was 11, and finally gave in to making a reservation when I was 14. He watched as person after person gave answer to this man at the table. Some were younger, some were older. Those too young to make a reservation were let through with no question to ask them at all. Some were waiting in line to get in because of sickness, others because they had drowned or been run over, had been through fire or war. He heard how the sullen, spoiled, and hateful had been transformed just by making this reservation. He heard those in the line tell of the many places reservations had been made: at school, at home, at Sunday school, and at church. He saw people in line from all walks of life: the poor, the rich, the drunk, the lame, the orphan, the thief, from many countries and colors. All had something in common: death had visited them. But most importantly, they all had something else in common: they could give a time and place when they'd made a reservation to get in. So he listened to the answers, and he came to understand that this was a picture of some saints all through the ages at the moments of death. And he remembered being asked when he was a youth, "If you were asked why you could enter heaven, what would you say?" In anguish, he remembered his flippant answer to that question: "Why, I've been better than most. God would have to let me in." He bowed his head in grief, and as he did so, he saw the last person in line going forward. He heard him be asked the same question that was given to the others, and in further anguish, he heard the young man give the same answer he had spoken as a young man: "Why, I've been better than most. God will let me in." The man looked on as this young man was turned away and led to a different entrance that he had not seen before. It was across the way, and as the entrance was unbarred, he caught a glimpse of flames and smelled smoke and heard horrible screams. Into this the young man was thrown, weeping and gnashing his teeth. And in his dream he fell to his knees and cried and wailed, "That is I! That is I! What must I do to be saved from this?" While he kneeled, he heard the voice of a young child being questioned by its mother. "What is the beginning of knowledge, son?" He heard the little voice answer, "The fear of the Lord, Mama." And the mother again spoke and told her son, "Remember, son, the fool doesn't like wisdom. Never be a fool, son." He knew the voice was his own mother speaking to him as a child. His grief became greater at this knowledge, but he could not quiet the voice of the little boy as it went on to quote a verse from the Bible. He looked up and listened and remembered the time he had quoted that verse in church. He had not paid any heed to the strange words at the time, but now he listened intently as the little child said, "To an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you." He knew this was not the whole verse, and he struggled in his mind to remember the beginning. It was with joy that he found the words in his memory and uttered them aloud. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to his abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation." Then he awoke with the words of the verse still etched on his mind, and behold, it was only a dream, but the truth he could not escape. And he could not sleep, but sat awake thinking and praying, and knowing himself to be a sinner in the sight of God, that nothing but Jesus' blood could save. Then he understood, and kneeling beside the bench he prayed, "O Lord, let me not be cast out of heaven when the time comes to die. I am a sinner and deserve to be cast out, but you have died for me. Please wash away my sin in your blood, and reserve me a place in heaven." And he thanked God for that snowy night when he could not find a room in a comfortable hotel because of the lack of a reservation. And he thanked God that he now had a place reserved in heaven for him, and that he had his answer for God now. "What can I do to enter heaven, Lord?" "Nothing at all. It is you and only you who has done everything. I rest in your salvation and ask for your mercy and grace."